Guy, shall we come to you first? Oh, yeah, I think we're going to have to. Hugh, could you talk a second? Yes, we've got you. Go for it. Yeah.
Sorry. Too many devices, obviously. Some good points made by both our colleagues. I think I'd want to take a slight step back and actually focus on crime in the countryside. If you look at how people who live in the communities that are sometimes affected by hunts and sometimes not, because they don't occur everywhere, thankfully, it's crime. And what we should be doing is getting Labour people elected as police and crime commissioners. It's good to have stronger law and clearer law, but if you don't have a police force that is properly motivated and actually doing the job in the field, either because it's not being led in a way that would prioritise certain things, or because not least post austerity, but continued sort of decline in police numbers, we're not going to get the outcomes that we want, and the people who live in these places are not going to get the outcomes that they want. So I think there's a slightly bigger question, a bigger picture that we need to look at, which is the state of criminal justice, solving of crime in rural and coastal areas. And going back to a report that FABIANS did a few years ago called Labour Country, it was really quite clear in that if we want to get people on side to some of the agendas that we have, we've got to start with them and where they are. So, how do you stop things being nicked from people's sheds in fields and farmers' equipment? You'll build a narrative and support for proper application of all law. So that's where I would start.
Absolutely, and really liked that you looked at another angle of it. That's a really good perspective to take in, because, as the webinar showed, there were a lot of police commissioners on there itself who are very much complicit in the whole situation. Rachel in the comments made a really good point about obviously not stereotyping. Fox hunting is not conducted everywhere in the countryside, and absolutely no one is assuming that here. But it has become more prevalent of a problem. And with the rise, with the leak in the media, obviously this has come to the foreground, especially in the midst of the pandemic, where a lot of people do feel that, these hunts are going out. There's a lot of pictures without social distancing, without masks, and there are a lot of sports indoors banned, in contrast to that kind of practice, which, you can have your opinions on. So Guy, could we come to you for final thoughts on this question, please?
Yeah, I'd like to completely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think in my view, and I think the consensus in the Labour Party, is that hunting is immoral. It is wrong, and this kind of hunting is quite elitist as well. And I think Sue's touched on a really good point. Obviously, being in the House of Lords and looking at the legislation aspect of it, the Hunting Act, and the consensus at the moment is that there's always a way around it. There's always a way for local groups to sort of skirt around the law. And I think from a legislative perspective, what our MPs, what our councillors, and what our representatives need to be doing is working on that act and closing the loopholes. On top of reforming that act as well, I think one of the points raised in the comments about the stereotypes is really important. There's a sort of a stereotype that goes around, it's maybe even unconsciously, that in rural areas, everyone's in support of hunting, and it's a community thing that everyone comes together to do. But I think there's a broad consensus on this in rural areas, or at least where I'm from, that this type of hunting is wrong. And I think if we, from a grassroots level, as Hugh said, elect police and crime commissioners, elect councillors, all Labour representatives who will work with local police and local people to put a stop to this, I think that's the way we sort of sort it out from a ground level and up. But then you've got the legislation sort of coming top down, and that two-pronged approach will hopefully put an end to these immoral practices.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Guy, and great points made. Sue, I think you wanted to quickly come back on Michael's question. I know that you made the news last year, but it's obviously not completely unusual, but I do welcome your elaboration on the matter.
No, I was just really interested to see what Michael had put, that he thought that his rights had been mainly focused since the 2000s. I'll just tell you what happened at my introduction, because we'd actually had a conversation with one of the newspapers, because we thought that we were going to be doing a first, which was that both myself being introduced and my two supporters, Baroness Jones and Baroness Smith, were also going to be wearing faux fur. And that first time ever, someone being introduced and both their supporters would all have been in FOFA. When we got there was only one FOFA robe, and why? We were promised 3. And we were told that actually only 2 exist. And one of them had been used a couple of days previously by Zach Goldsmith. And because of COVID, it then had to be in quarantine for 72 hours. So there was only ever going to be a maximum of 2 available, all the rest of fur. And what that did is it meant that we were able to go to the committee that kind of oversees kind of the way that Hassels operates. And so they really need to look at this because this just isn't good enough. And then one of my colleagues, who's coming a few weeks later, he had to do the same, only he wore a faux fur robe, which is why we did set a precedent in that my 2 supporters were part of my little parade without robes on. And normally, you either, if you don't wear the robes, they have to sit down the front, they can't parade, but because it was a mistake, we've been promised and they're allowed to. So it's actually a really big issue. And one of the problems why it's not changing is that the robes they got are ones that people have bought and have then given to them when they've retired or they've died. And they're very expensive. But it is a really interesting point. Is it better to spend the robes together?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thank you. And I massively applaud your effort and the fact that you raised awareness, whether meaning to or not, of that issue, and the fact that fur should not ever be a standard or a de facto default to go to in terms of what a uniform anywhere should be. So Tina, could I hand over to you for your questions? Thanks everyone for answers for those.
Thank you. I thought those responses to Cecilia's question were really, really interesting. So obviously the really important elements here are that we don't want to stereotype any communities, and we recognise that there are varying interests within all communities, and rural communities in that sense are no different. And we really want to take communities with us in terms of the Labour Party. So my question really is, how do we do that in terms of climate change, which is obviously really important and we're running out of time? How do we bring a wide range of people with us with these differing views? And I'd actually like to go to Guy first, as you're a campaigner on this.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's a really good question as to how not only can we start conversations in our communities about climate change, but what can we do as a party to bring about policies. Obviously, the Green New Deal was a massive point of emphasis in the last general election campaign, and I know it's something that internally within the party and in the Fabian Society as well, that lots of campaigners are leading on this. But I think in terms of getting quite forward-thinking and progressive environmental policies into mainstream politics, we need to ask residents what they want, what they think, and what their concerns are. It needs to be a consultation where we're listening, not telling. We found it in Hertsmere when we're running campaigns that in the first couple of months or the first couple of weeks, the best thing to do is when we're door knocking, is not to tell them who we are, but ask them what they want and build our campaigns on that. So I think it's about going into communities and seeing what we can do with their area. Of course, there are some blanket policies we're looking at as a party that will be different to each community. So looking at renewable energies, looking at solar panels, looking at different ways of doing things in our communities. But as well as listening to local residents, let's listen to small businesses. Let's listen to the key holders and the gate holders in each communities who know what each community needs. And let's try and bring our progressive climate change platform first and into communities from a grassroots level.
I think that's really, really important. And I know that Labour Doorstep have some plans for campaigning as well, if you'd like to talk about that a little bit as well.
Definitely, yeah. So Labour Doorstep is an organisation I'm so lucky to be a part of, and a lot of members of the Fabian Society as well have helped set this up, Panny especially. and Elliot as well, and Lauren as our graphics designer. Labour Doorstep originally was just created out the idea that every election, the hashtag Labour Doorstep goes around all over social media when we're knocking on doors. So we thought it'd be quite nice to create a little organisation where, when it was coming in during the general elections, we could all see these nice pictures of everyone knocking on doors. But since then, it's sort of evolved. We've got a team of 20 now of graphic designers and campaign coordinators and officers who have come together and are trying to influence CLPs at a grassroots level. So we've got a massive Facebook group of over 1,000 people, all campaigners from across the country. So whether you're in Blyth or Cardiff or Glasgow or down in Brighton, you can have conversations with any CLP anywhere in this collective forum. And so what Labour Doorstep have been trying to do is trying to help CLPs with our advice and expertise to create content and trying to explain to them basically how you can influence grassroots politics. And the way we're doing that is creating a consultation, because there'll be ideas over in Scotland and in Wales that CLPs are doing, that CLPs over here will be successful.
Thank you for that. Just going to Joyner next. I've heard a lot about the focus that Stroud District Council has had on green issues, and I was wondering if you could, just in answering the question, expand on that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, it's quite hard to do that in a summary form. I mean, I don't know if people might be not familiar with the political makeup of Stroud District Council. Is we're actually run as a no overall control council. So we've been in an alliance with the Greens and the Lib Dems, well, for nearly 9 years now. So quite a successful alliance in many ways, but obviously led by Labour. I mean, I think the question was around how do we take communities with us? And I think this is about looking at that rural aspect of it. So I just wondered how to address that specifically in relation to climate change. And it was a point I would have made today anyway. One thing that comes out really strongly out of our district, which is a makeup of sort of, we've got about 5 or 6 market towns and then a lot of smaller communities. And we do an annual survey. And what comes out every year, very, very powerful, is people's real pride in where they live. And that's sort of like something that unifies them across, you know, we're divided in many ways now, aren't we? But actually pride in where you live. I represent a town of Dursley, which is just a small town in the district. And people, I'd say people live here for 2 different reasons. They lived here all their lives or they've moved here. But there's a shared pride in that community. So I think for Labour, sort of to lean into that is really important. And the care for the environment and the whole issue around climate change is one obvious place in which that can happen. I mean, as a council, yes, we have been extremely active in our environmental policies. And I think if you look at rural issues, one of our top priorities would be around housing. And one of the problems we've got is we've committed to become carbon neutral by 2030, but obviously we don't have a great say over all of the aspects of carbon emissions. Transport as a district council isn't really within our remit, and we've got the M5 running through the district, so it's a bit difficult to know how much we can do about that. But housing and buildings come second. So there's a real, there's ways that you can tackle it across, I would say, across the whole spectrum. So on the one hand, you've got, how do you tackle that really major issue of rural poverty? We've got lots of people who live, who don't even have properly insulated homes. Some of them live in sort of park homes as well. So we've managed to access some funding from government to make sure they get properly insulated. Some work's been done around the real knock-on effect on people's health if they're not living in a well-insulated house. So that's one thing we can do at one end. And obviously as Labour, that's very much our sort of core priority, isn't it, around housing. So we do that. And at the other end, you've obviously got people who have got the ability to, who have got income, who could be looking at, for example, insulating their homes, are very motivated about environmental issues. So enabling them to do that. And one thing we've done in our district is we've got like a network now of carbon neutral groups. So every town, and actually increasingly all the villages as well, have got their own local group, which is run self-organised by local people, and they just have their own bespoke way of looking at what the issues might be locally. They organise events online at the moment, or they'll investigate other things. So I think those are just some tasters of some of the stuff we're doing, but I think those are very specific to rural communities. I think there's often the feeling with, you know, we focused a lot in Labour, don't we, on metropolitan issues and what it looks like from a metropolitan point of view. But I think there's a huge opportunity there in those rural communities to do stuff around the environment. And I also think 2 other points I'll make to finish is we see ourselves very much as a council as enabling communities to do things themselves. We don't have infinite resources to do it for them, nor do we have that much control over actually the carbon emissions which are coming out of in our district. Only a certain amount that we can do ourselves. our council houses that we build ourselves, we built to a very high standard. But I think you can't underestimate in that pride of place. You know, you might say sort of talking about picking up litter or getting a new bin is not necessarily a major thing on the huge sort of spectrum of climate change and carbon emissions and all the rest of it. But I think often that is a way to begin with people. And, you know, or about, you know, we have debate always about the verges and are we putting wildflowers in the verges and things like that. So I think no issue is too small. If it's something that resonates with local people, use that, particularly as a local candidate or a councillor. That might be the way to begin. And it just creates that narrative for Labour as being this very sort of, we're there for you, we speak for you. And then that is a platform to speak about those wider issues. I mean, I'll just finish to say that I think regardless of whether you're in the city or a village, people are extremely motivated to do stuff about the environment. In our survey, it comes out every year as a top priority for us. So just the fact that you live in a village doesn't mean you're not as motivated to do something as elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely spot on. And there's a number of points there that a lot of people on this call can take forward as local candidates and just community organisers, really, and whatever they choose to do in the community and voluntary sector as well. I want to go to Hugh Lloyd next.
Thank you. Hopefully you can still hear me and the tech hasn't fallen over. Thank you. My day job is climate change and doing things on these things. And in a way, I only wanted to say one thing about that. And that's that the system, in terms of how electricity bills and things like that work and where investment and incentives go, tends to work against coast and country communities and in favour of urban ones. And if we want to think about our version of rewarding and responding and giving people the opportunity to do what's right, not just for them, but for the climate, we need to think about how that works. But I think I'd really want to focus on the 3 or 4 comments that people have made about the listening. The one seat we gained in 2015 was Wirral West, and by many accounts, it was on the basis of a locally initiated campaign against fracking. So you've got a local issue that's climate relevant, but in the place, Labour, as Tina, as you just said, we were paying attention, we were engaged. I'm sure we were doing annual surveys, but we should be doing them in every constituency, not just ones that might be targets or anything like that. And that's the way to build our understanding of what in a sense is concerning people, where they want political parties to put their weight behind issues and solutions for them. In other places, it will be flooding. We haven't had a big bad flood season yet, but you can expect that will happen between now and Easter. Those communities need our help in adaptation as much as we collectively need to do mitigation. So I think that the most important thing is, can we be in every place listening to a community? And most areas of, well, every area of Britain has got Labour Party members, many more than any other political party. Doesn't matter where you're thinking about. So it's that level. It's the town and parish councillors who are Labour. It's the district or other councillors who are Labour. You don't need an MP to do this, but you do need to organise. And it may well be that we need to get guys, colleagues and comrades more active in every part of the country, but they're not the only thing that's doing that. Obviously, we and others are. So listen, pay attention to what people are being bothered about, and then use Labour values to help show them how we can do a better job with and for them.
Great, thank you very much for that. I think that's really, really important. And on getting our message out as well, which is essential with the massive set of elections coming up. And last but not least, I'd like to go to Baroness Hayman, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important that you've just been talking about councillors, because we don't actually have a lot of representation in Parliament in rural areas. We just don't, particularly after the last election. And our councillors, our Labour councillors in rural areas, are really important in how people perceive the Labour Party. Because I think one of the big problems we've got is about perception. It's not necessarily about our policies. It's about perception. It's about people not seeing, country people a lot of the time don't see Labour as the party for them, for whatever reason. A lot of that's cultural. And so councillors have a big role to play in that. And I think the party should actually support them a bit more in that area, to be fair. But coming back to climate change, I mean, one of the big things that I was working on in the run-up to the last election which is for to get farming to net zero by 2040. That's a huge challenge, and they had a roadmap to that. So I think it's important as politicians that we support, because people think about emissions in all sorts of different ways. They think about transport, and they think about heating and so on and so on, and energy. But they don't think actually that a lot of the way farming is practiced at the moment causes all sorts of problems, and we really should be working with our rural communities and our farmers and people like the NFU in order for them to play their part in order to actually tackle climate change. Because farming's under a huge amount of pressure. It always has been for years and years and years. But obviously with the cap going and Brexit, there's further pressures on farmers. It's much more difficult for them to plan any distance ahead now because they just don't know what's happening. So if we're also asking them to help tackle climate change, we have to be giving them that proper support, and that has to be financial as well as any other support as well. And I think the other thing, when we're looking at climate change, when we come up with policies, and when the central government comes up with policies, it has to think about how those policies are going to affect rural communities and what you can do to support rural communities to get there. And I'll take a couple of examples. First is electric cars. A lot of pressure on people. You shouldn't be having diesel. You should be having your electric car. That's great if you're in a city. Now, we have to have a car that can get me to my station to get the train to London. My nearest mainline station is 32 miles away. The electric cars at the moment that we're looking at have a maximum distance of 30 miles. So I couldn't even get to the station before I ran out of fuel. So we're looking to get a hybrid car, which is the next best option. But people need to be much more aware when they're making these policies. The civil servants in London, the central government, who's very, very metropolitan based, needs to think about that, because rural communities often think they see new policies and they think, oh God, okay, how are we supposed to manage that? Here they are, you know, they're not thinking about us. And I think another one that's come out recently is the issues around wood burners. Yes, we know there are particulates that come from wood burners. We know there is some pollution, but I would say the majority of rural homes that I know have got a wood burner in them, because otherwise it's very difficult to keep warm, especially if you're in an old house. So again, it needs to be thought of. It's not necessarily wrong with a policy, but it has to be thought of in the round. And that's, again, looking at heating more broadly. A lot of rural homes are heated with oil, and that's actually quite difficult then to change. So again, when you're looking at your policies, they need to be thought of in the round as to the kind of impact that's going to have on small villages like the one that I live in the middle of nowhere in Cumbria, where we've got no gas, very poor broadband, no mobile signal. One of the things that drives me bonkers is I find it almost impossible for me to buy things online now, which we're having to do a lot, because everyone insists on sending you a text message with a code. I can't get it. It's
Yeah.
a problem. We need to think more broadly about the impact on rural communities for all decisions that we make.
Yeah, I think that what you said about farming communities in particular really spoke to me. That's something that, you know, we have struggled to communicate with them and to communicate and kind of liaise with them on what they think. And I think transport across the country is an issue, but in the east of England, there's a lot of places where you actually have to go into London to then get back out and back into the east of England, which is just, it's ridiculous. And I couldn't summarize it any better than what Hugh said in the comments, actually, which is that Labour needs to rural-proof everything it does. And I'm going to pass it back to Cecilia.
Thanks very much. And that quite neatly brings me on to a final question from us. If you could keep answers fairly short so that we've got enough time to close, and also for Q&A from the audience as well. I can see a couple of questions coming up. So in 2019, we had 89% of rural communities voting for the Conservative Party and 8.5% for Labour. In 1997, we held 179 seats, and we've now taken a digit off that to 17. In Labour's Green Economic Recovery paper, which we as the Environment Network actually contributed to by submitting commissions to the National Policy Forum, the top 3 focuses are recovering jobs, retraining workers, and rebuilding business. Do you think this is enough to win over the rural electorate, or would you go the other way towards the climate emergency with economic decarbonisation and biodiversity protection? So I'd like to come to Baroness Sue first, Baroness Hayman first, and then we'll go round.
Well, it's difficult. I mean, I don't always think things have to be either or. You know, I think one of the things I think we have an opportunity to do is bring green jobs, if you like, into kind of more peripheral rural areas. And a lot of coastal areas, like my old constituency, is heavily rural, very big long coast. You know, you can we're looking at tidal schemes. You can bring good green jobs in through green energy schemes. We were looking at a recycled steel plant, for example. So there's if you're moving into a green economy, there are ways that you can focus. I mean, a lot of the rural communities that are struggling are ones that actually had some form of manufacturing or mining or some kind of industry base that went in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and has never really been replaced. So that economic recovery is critical, I think, in a lot of areas. Otherwise, rural areas become too dependent on a number of small farms and tourism, and that's not a long-term strategy for your economic recovery. So I think we need to really look at how we develop the green economics, focusing on those areas. And I think a lot of the reasons that they have left the Labour Party is that we've never really, I don't think, for a number of years, focused Labour's properly on rural communities. We seem to have become more and more a party of metropolitan areas, and it started and became quite inward looking. And certainly when I was Shadow Secretary of State, one thing I tried really hard to do was turn this into a more outward looking party towards rural areas. I think we got some upset by Brexit last time, certainly my constituency. So I think diversity is really important. I mean, we've got some we do a big kind of rewilding project on like 5 acres of our land. And a lot of people are interested in actually working in the world, doing that kind of thing. And the whole new agriculture bill, while I think it has many, many failings, I think the work it's trying to do to encourage more biodiversity in the work farms is important and will be successful.
Absolutely. So the last bit cut out a little bit, but I got the gist of what you were saying, and really good points. Thank you very, very much, Sue. So next, could I come to you, Doina, for your thoughts on this?
Thank you. It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, we're all, you know, the pandemic has occupied our thoughts, hasn't it, for nearly a year now. And it's just shown when there is an emergency, government can step up and do it. But actually, really, the climate is the bigger emergency, let's face it, and the one really we should be putting our efforts into. As a council, we declared a climate emergency a couple of years ago. But I mean, to be fair to the Tories, they said, well, what are you doing? How are you making this an emergency? And though many councils did it around the country, actually, when we did actually go for a real emergency with the pandemic, it did actually show we could have been doing more. I mean, I think, but having said that, although if we look at the bigger picture, the environment is the major issue that's threatening the whole planet. And there's a very limited thing that any of us can do unless the systems change. Going back to what I said, the council does this annual survey. The environment, interesting enough, as a quite motivated local population that likes to do recycling and all the rest of it, environment was always a top concern. That flipped this year. So when we did the survey over the summer, the economy came to the top. So I think that is where people are particularly concerned. I think you're asking us to question around what it would look for Labour. And it's interesting, I saw the comments in the thing around, you know, Labour being a toxic brand and how we build back from that. I do think it's really important, and going back to sort of what I've been saying before, is about building that trust locally. And as a local person representing a local area, you do have, whether you're a candidate or a councillor or even just someone who works within the community, you know, to be known to be Labour and to build that trust up is really important. And so I do think, although the environment is the key thing, I do think if we're looking over the next couple of years, even when the pandemic has sort of ended, the long tail of the economic impact on our rural communities is going to be here for a long time to stay. If you just take one issue, high streets, you know, our local businesses taking absolute clobbering at the moment, and the impact on that, and all the knock-on effects of that. We want to keep our towns vibrant. I just something a little bit more hopeful on that, though, anecdotally, and you may have experienced this in other areas as well, is that I think the shine has gone off living in cities, and we've definitely seen people moving into towns. Some of our town councils say they've noticed more footfall in the high street in towns, so there is a bit of a ray of hope. So maybe people will move back into towns, and I do actually think, looking at the towns, the life of towns as a sort of centre for Labour, and I think you all mentioned about town and parish councils. Absolutely, we really encourage people interested in getting involved. That's a good first step. And town councils, in their own way, can also be extremely important. So I guess my feeling is that as Labour, we really need to put that economic, those priorities top, and really use the right language, you know, investing in our communities. I think there's also a role for us to play locally, as to be clear that we're standing up for communities. You know, we've got this very centralised government. Where's the Conserve gone out of the Conservatives? And I think that also can play to local communities, because they're ripping up all sorts of things. And I think there's a real opportunity for us there. But I do think it has to be very local, the message, and really, you know, and very much based on that community approach, that raising our profile locally, and also having extremely practical suggestions about what could be done. So we really can demonstrate that we are supporting those communities and high streets. And if you're in the privilege of working with a council and running a council, you can do that. Having said which, I know some extremely effective Labour councillors who might be only one or two on a council, who can actually find ways themselves to influence. So I guess there is a lot that we could be done. I think there's a huge potential there for us to do that. But I think also Sue made the point around, is it right to have that the sort of trade-off between the two? Personally, I feel that the investment in the economy absolutely can be done with a green agenda, and that's where we should be going. Just one final thing I'll mention, because I did mention about buildings earlier. We're really aware that there has to be a mass retrofit across the country on all our buildings, particularly on private housing. And at the moment, there isn't the capacity there. The building and the trade and the construction sector haven't really moved towards providing that capacity. We've got people locally who'd like to do it, but we don't have the capacity. So there's a whole possible sort of potential there to train people up, something we're starting to explore as a council. You know, if we're doing that across the country, training that also could play to the issue around how we keep young people living in our areas. So I think that's one aspect we could focus on, and Labour. And also you can make it quite personalised, because it might be you're going to get someone out of fuel poverty, or it might be you're going to enable someone who would like to do the right thing, who's more wealthy, to insulate the house. I mean, just one example, you know, lots of listed buildings, extremely challenging to work out how you could, or an old house, how you could do that. So I do think there's a lot there, and I do think there is a common thread that the economy, investment, making the quality of people's lives better, and also the environment can all actually be tied together and don't necessarily have to be seen as separate.
Absolutely. I think quite a lot of people agree with you, Doina. I certainly do. And we've, even in the Fabians, we've seen a huge and deliberately made a complete decentralization from London, kind of as a kind of gathering and as a society, making sure that, you know, we've got different regional groups going on now. And it's the same with a lot of the old rural agendas in terms of devolving power to the counties and countries, to the countryside, and making sure that they can run their own communities. Really good points. Thank you. Hugh, could I come to you next, please?
Thank you. Perhaps a couple to add to some of the ones that have already been made. I think one would be, we've got to think about the jobs and the employment that work in particular places. There will be green economy jobs in every place, but the actual ones that are appropriate to Stroud or to Cumbria will be different. And we've got to own that difference. I think I'd add to that something about, actually, let's think about what keeps the value in a place. Having 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 wind turbines on the local upland to you can actually extract a lot of value elsewhere. unless there's community or shared ownership or local authority ownership or something that keeps it in the community. So it's not just a question of having this kit. It is also a question of who owns it and how does that play into the local economy, both in the construction of it or the refurbishment and the ownership and maintenance. So there's some important economic flow questions in there. I think another part of that economy question is that there are a lot more self-employed or multiply employed people in coast and country areas. And we just need to think about how they'll recover from this, because quite a few of them are completely unsupported by the measures that the Treasury have put in. Thankfully, Labour's having a go at trying to sort that out, but we need to think on for what that might mean when we're in government, because that's all part of making a local economy function well and being seen to sort of reward and acknowledge how a non-urban economy works compared to an urban one. So there's quite a lot in there, but I think we do have to get specific and sort of place orientated, which would take me right back to the earlier points a couple of people have also made. How do you build local campaigns that respond to local needs, local challenges, and how do we use town and parish councillors as part of that process? Because there are Labour and co-op town and parish councillors almost everywhere in the country, community councillors in Wales and Scotland, yet Labour doesn't really support them, and we need to find a way of building a network. So if you're interested in that, drop me a line. Thanks.
Absolutely, and our chair Mark agrees with you in the comments. Hugh, really well said. And it just comes back to that kind of mutual like the fact that it's not mutually exclusive, of course, as Sue remarked, and also as Doina said, you have to look at the real world applicability, and it has to be place specific, not just a sweeping generalization of what the whole country needs. Because of course, you know, as a policy advisor, I'm always asking, as was mentioned earlier, you can say, oh, we've declared a climate emergency, but what are you actually going to do about it? What are everyday people going to do together? And then what are councils and bigger administrations and the government actually going to implement in real terms? So lastly, could I come to you, Guy, for your closing thoughts on this generally?
Yeah, I agree with so many of the points that have been made so far, but I think in terms of the party's approach to win back rural areas, we need to start again and go back to the basics. We need to, at a very simple level, I think this is the point you was making, is get a parish or borough or county council in every region of the country so that we have a Labour representative that can inspire confidence in the party in all of our communities. But I think with that, there has to be investment from the National Party as well. In an area like I'm in Hertsmere, it's a very safe Tory seat, but recently we've gone from 2 councillors to 6. So slowly but surely we are trying our best to fight that rising tide. But if we don't have the investment from the party, we have to operate on a shoestring on the money that's given by local members. We need money from the National Party to be able to run these campaigns and do these operations. And I think there's a real sense of, from a Labour Party perspective, that we've been sort of left behind by the party despite the best efforts. And I really hope into the future and under the new leadership and with new teams coming into place as well, that we can really look and prioritise those areas. The last thing I'd say on this is I think someone's touched on earlier is that post-pandemic, we've got a chance to offer a package to people. And I think people are going to be listening post-pandemic who've traditionally voted Tory, but they're going to be listening, well, what do Labour have to say about this? I've had a tough situation with jobs, or I've had a tough situation losing family members. I think people are listening now because this pandemic has been so devastating. So we need to come up with a package, but ultimately we need people to communicate that package to people. So as long as we have that network of councillors and local advocates in every area to do that, then I think we can really make edgeways in communities. But we need investment, is what I'd say. So yeah.
Absolutely, Guy. Thank you. Excellent points made and a really refreshing perspective on it. Big thank you to me for coming. You're, you know, as a panel, you've been absolutely brilliant. And can I hand you back to Tina?
Okay, so I'm just going to take a couple of Q&A questions very quickly. I do think we'll run slightly over, but that should be okay, looking at the agenda. So the first question that I want to ask, and I'm going to take them together because they concern children and young people. One of them is from Rachel, which is, what can we do to better support rural schools? She attended one with 60 to 70 pupils and has been a school governor. They're seen as inefficient at the macro level, but at the centre of community, and offer a really good education, and often national policies don't fit them. And there's a question from Adam, which is concerning opportunity for young people and the lack of opportunity, which leads to young people moving out and aging communities, which exacerbates the existing problems. How can we begin to approach this issue, especially as the young Fabians? And I'd like to go to Baroness Heyman first, please.
Right, okay. First of all, rural schools. I mean, it's a really difficult one because rural schools, as Rachel rightly says, don't always match what national policy demands, mainly due to the numbers. And actually, it's not just in education. We fall by the wayside on health, for example, and all sorts of things that you don't get. You shouldn't be allowed to do X because you haven't got the numbers, you know, to fit the national policies. One of the problems, I don't know what it's like in other areas, but certainly one of the problems that we have had in Cumbria is that a lot of the very small village schools have fallen foul of the new Ofsted arrangements, and because of that have been forced into academisation. That forced academisation has then meant that they are now getting shared head teachers. So each school does not have its own head teacher anymore. And that then causes its own problems. So my big concern is that the current education policy is actually meaning that children in smaller schools are not only not able always to have the same connectivity of, say, bigger metropolitan schools to be able to use the internet better, but that actually they don't get as much focused teaching anymore due to the way academisation of small schools is being made to happen. And it does worry me that so many of the schools are constantly under threat of closure. My children went to school with less than 50 pupils. And because of that, there were only 2 classes. And that doesn't necessarily fit national models. Yet the teaching was good. My children got a good education. They've all done well. We need to be much more flexible about how we look at what a good education is and what the markers are for children achieving, and ensure that all children get a really, really good education. And it's not necessarily down to the size of the school. And we also need to look at how we make those schools better, because a lot of them are really old Victorian buildings that actually need some real investment into the fabric of the building as well. I mean, when they brought the new policy in around hot meals at lunchtime, lots of the schools were unable to manage that because they didn't have their own kitchens and they couldn't get the deliveries in. And again, the councils helped brilliantly to try and support schools with that. But again, it's looking at how policies made nationally don't necessarily fit small schools. Just very, very quickly on school children, I think it's incredibly important that children feel that they've got a future in the area that they live if they want to stay there, and that they can stay there if they want to. And that comes back to jobs, it comes back to good, well-paid jobs, it comes back to things like good transport links. We have very good transport links. It makes it much more difficult for people to get out and about and do other things as well, not just about work. You can't trying to get a job somewhere island if you can't drive. It's expensive to learn to drive, it's expensive to buy a car, it's expensive to pay insurance. We have 1 bus a week, for example. So we need to look at, you know, it's not just about having good jobs and an economy, but it's about having good transport links so that young people can get good jobs, but also get there, get out and see their friends, you know, enjoy life a bit.
Thank you. I'd like to go to Guy next. Oh, he's dropped. Oh, let's go to Hugh, please.
Okay, sure. Hopefully you can. Okay, we've been told to finish up quickly. I guess the two things I'd say is we do need to think. We're talking about rural proofing in a lot of respects, thinking about how the nation supports every child in their education, whatever sort of community they come from or live in. We used to have a slogan as a Labour government: every child mattered. So we need to think about what that means in practice, and taking a sort of purely efficiency sort of view never works for everywhere. Just doesn't. So that would be one part of it, and it might be just as the Boundary Commission looks at places like the Isle of Wight and says, well, it should always have a certain representation, or the Outer Hebrides a certain representation. It's not about pure applying a sort of hard economics to everything. Let's think about what this place needs. It needs a primary school. If that ebbs and flows in its numbers, then we should respond accordingly. It probably means that many more local councils, and I include town and parish, need more power so that they can be a voice for those communities and those services. And we've talked about that in our manifesto for towns in 2018, 2019. And it might also be that digital connectivity is a real thing that is future facing, but could help support some of these things, over and above Sue's point about sort of physical connectivity. I think in terms of young people and the opportunities available to them, I'm not sure you can always remove the sort of glitzy lights of London or wherever it might be, but you can certainly make more opportunity in places. Some of that will be digitally based, and we've got to sort out mobile and broadband connectivity for, let's say, 98% of the population. I exclude the 2% who prefer to live off grid, because that's perfectly legitimate too. So let's think about how that might work and put some more effort into what's it going to be for every community. So I think I'm coming round to saying, let's make sure Labour Rural proofs all its manifestos from now onwards. And let's also make sure we're not overly economic in how we support every child, every community, every place, so that it might thrive. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we've got Guy back, so let's go to Guy next, please.
Sorry about that. I just had some connection issues, but I think that quite well it made my point I was about to make about internet connection in rural areas. So maybe that was a sort of, it happened on purpose. But so in regards to young people and funding, I think we all know the impacts of austerity. 1,000 youth centres closing since 2010 and 70% funding cuts to services for young people. I think that's really stripped back local communities to the bare bone. We've had a youth centre close in our area, and that's been devastating for local children. And we've seen crime gone up in the area. We've seen drug dealing in the streets becoming more prevalent. And I think what I think politicians forget is that when they make these funding cuts, this has real implications for actual people living in communities and children as well. So from a Labour Party perspective, when we're looking at all areas, it's looking at one, reversing austerity, but two, investing in young people, putting those funds back into those grassroots youth centre projects, back into playgrounds, back into food banks, back into all sorts of programs that work in communities to engage with young people, and funding back to schools as well, because we're seeing rising levels of academies, but much less money going into public schools. So I think investment is definitely a key issue. But yeah, communicating those policies to rural areas is the priority at the moment. So I hope in this upcoming set of elections we can get as many Labour councillors in every area as possible, and we can look to a better future for the party in these areas as well.
Thank you for that. I think that since the Tories have come into power, the way they've treated education has just been absolutely disgraceful. We've seen from schools not being able to open 5 days a week, to the exams fiasco, to the latest issue with free school meals, which is also recurring. I think a lot of the times as well, when we're looking at education, schools in in rural areas, we've seen that the Tories completely ignore the fact that there is a lot of poverty there. And that's something that I think local councils have been working really hard to tackle. And I'd like to go to Doina next, please.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Yeah, thanks. It's interesting, isn't it? I've got two university students. My kids are at home at the minute, so I'm creeping around because one of them's got exams today. So it's very lively at the minute for me. So, and also it's interesting what Howard was saying about the bright lights of cities. I think that my kids grew up, they went to a very small school locally, and then the local comprehensive, which is 5 minutes up the road, and they're desperate to get out and go somewhere else. So sometimes young people do want to move, don't they? But I think a couple of things I would say. I think Sue answered the question around rural schools really comprehensively. It's not really my area of expertise because as a district council, we don't really cover it. I'm not sure I could really add anything to that other than to say we have lots of really small schools in our district. And I think, we need to continue to support them because often they will be at the heart of the community. And you can't, again, going back to those issues around transport and trying to discourage people from driving here, there and everywhere. We want to keep those schools, those small schools. Often they can be brilliant schools for kids to go to. Often they really can. I know children who've gone to those very small schools where they thrived, where in a larger school in the next village, they wouldn't have done so well. So I think it's so important that we continue to have those available as an option. And in the rural areas, they are needed. So I think that's really important. I think Guy just touched on what I was going to say. The problem is, we come at the back of, we mustn't underestimate. I think sometimes we're in danger of losing that story around how much underinvestment, how many cuts there have been. In 2010, when the Conservatives came into power, literally we saw almost from 1 minute to the next, they just cut all the youth services locally in the county when austerity came in. And there was a real effort amongst the town and parishes, the sort of areas that previously wouldn't have provided that youth service. And they actually did step up and they've done it, and local community organisations as well. So in a very good sort of way at patching up the things, we do sort of step in. But I think there's a real issue. And I think the this question for young people is actually more of an issue for rural areas than it is for the urban areas, because all of the issues that we consider sort of challenges for the rural communities very much are the hardest for young people. And we've touched on, lack of transport. So if you're living in this town and you want to get a job, how on earth are you going to get to the city? Gloucester or Bristol are the two closest cities to us. So access to your sort of jobs is really difficult. We haven't really talked very much about housing and affordable housing for young people. If you want young people to stay in their communities, where on earth are they supposed to live? And I think that's a particularly pertinent issue for rural communities. And again, goes to what we should be doing as a Labour, is really sort of trying to ensure that we've got that housing for young people. And again, that everything's tied up. If you want people to work locally in many of those important jobs within the economy, if they haven't got places to live, then they're not going to be able to do it. So I think that's really important. And it's been a big discussion in Gloucestershire as a whole. How can we keep our young people locally? And I think we also mustn't look at young people as a complete homogenous blob. I think that's really important. They come from a wide range of backgrounds. And I'd say that you've got young people who will want to leave, that, like my children as an example, they want to go to the bright lights, they want to go to university, and obviously that will happen. I think you have to accept rural areas will see that. But I think if you take the slightly older age, people who are starting to think about starting a family, you may see that they'd like to come back to the rural areas. So then that sort of 18, sort of 20, early 20s, but then that slightly, we still call them young people, I hope, that might be extremely attractive. And those are the people who are just starting to get out to work. They'd like to raise their children, and let's bring them back. And they may find the rural areas extremely attractive and can continue to support and keep those communities vibrant. So I think when you talk about sort of how it looks like from a Labour point of view, I see this in two separate ways. One is, how we interest people in getting young people motivated and those issues that will speak to all the family to continue to vote for us and gain that support. But also, we also need to be thinking about who needs the support. And I think what we'll see in all rural communities is often there are two societies. That inequality is quite stark. And the young people I particularly would be concerned about how we are addressing their needs is those children who aren't, or young people aren't given the opportunity to go to university. They may be NEETs in no education or training, and what support gets provided for them, because often they will be left behind. They have no means by which to leave the communities in which they live. And so what are we doing to make their life chances better? So I think we haven't really talked much about inequality, but I think that's an extremely important issue as Labour that we really need to look at. And also throw into the mix as well, the issue around support with mental health. We've seen, certainly in Gloucestershire, rising levels of concern, particularly specifically amongst young people, and there is no support for them. One of the awful things that happens is if you've got mental health issues as a child, you're sort of wrapped around with that services, and then suddenly you get hit 18. And I know sort of personal families who've been in that situation. Suddenly you're in the adult system and you feel pretty much abandoned. And so I think there's a particular issue. We haven't really talked much about health and well-being and all of that, what that involves. And my real concern going forwards is what's the legacy of COVID? I mean, if you're a young person now, you know, I can live on my memories of good times I've had in the past and enjoying my social life. But for young people right now, it's just horrendous, really, isn't it? I think it's just really crummy, let's face it. So I think there's a lot of issues there. And I do think, you know, I really take what you're saying about rural proofing policies, absolutely important. And I think this question around young people is very pertinent to the rural question, quite different from the cities, which tend to naturally have a younger population.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, as someone who hasn't even been able to, I'm a first year university student and I haven't even been able to go into university. So the social aspect's clearly lacking there, and that has significant mental health impacts as well. So we've gone over by quite a bit and we're going to need to end this. Cool, but I'd like to say a massive, I'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our panelists and attendees. And I'd also like to say a big thank you to the Young Fabians executive for being so supportive, the East of England Regional Group, the Southwest Regional Group, and the Environment Network for making this idea we had for an event a reality. And I'd also like to say thank you to the Fabian Society staff for everything that's been involved in, you know, creating this great platform and bringing us together at this really difficult time. And I hope that everyone enjoys the rest of the conference. And before we end, I'd just like to pass back to Cecilia.
Yeah, absolutely echoing all those thank yous. And, you know, never had a platform where people are upside down. We have some great firsts in this pandemic. Sorry, and that's another classic. There's building works going on in my building. Nothing that I can really stop. But I don't know if you can still hear me, but I'll attempt because it's kind of intermittent. So, I've got silence. Brilliant. So, I mean, I feel like we've covered a lot, not anymore. Rural proofing, closing loopholes in the Hunting Act, reforming it from the angle of health and safety, decentralising power, place-specific campaigns, the ecological and climate emergency, and how that can be reconciled with appealing rural policy and the interconnection between housing, transport and jobs. So I feel like we've collectively set the world to rights. And I was also going to say I write for a few political publications like the Oxford Political Review, Global Politics and Backbench magazines. So I'm going to write up an article on this and would love to pull a few quotes from this event. I will, of course, be in touch to check if that's all right and if you like the article, etc. So generally, thank you so much for coming, for dealing with various technical audio and everything in between difficulties, and if you tune into the rest of the events this weekend, I hope you enjoyed them. So thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Bye now. Thank you.
Bye.